A desperate, heart-wrenching scream shattered the calm atmosphere of the upscale restaurant. "Somebody help my husband! He's not breathing!" Lisa's voice rang out in panic, the words spilling from her lips in a chaotic rush of terror. Her scream pierced through the laughter and chatter of the patrons, and a sudden, eerie silence enveloped the room. Forks clattered onto plates, glasses rattled, and heads whipped around in confusion as the magnitude of the crisis began to sink in. People froze, their eyes darting from Lisa's frantic form to her husband, Mark, who was lying motionless on the floor, his face drained of color, his chest barely rising and falling. For a moment, everything seemed suspended in time. Mark's body was a stark contrast to the vibrant energy of the restaurant. His fingers twitched once, then grew still. Lisa's hands trembled as she knelt by him, the reality of the situation sinking in. Her husband was dying, and she was powerless to stop it. "Just a few tables away, Doctor." Jordan had been quietly enjoying his meal, savoring the calm of the evening. But at the sound of Lisa's frantic cry, his head snapped up, his training kicking in instantly. Without a second thought, he stood up, pushing his chair back, and began to move toward the commotion. His steps were measured but quick as he navigated through the crowded restaurant, weaving between the wide-eyed diners who were all staring, frozen in disbelief. "I'm a doctor," Dr. Jordan announced firmly, his voice cutting through the tension in the air. "I need to check his pulse," he added, kneeling beside Mark's prone form. But before he could even touch the man, Lisa's body shot in front of her husband like a human shield, blocking his every movement. Her eyes were wide with fear and determination, and her voice, though shaky with emotion, carried a tone of authority that could not be ignored. "Get away from him!" she barked, her voice trembling but sharp, desperate to protect the man she loved from what she perceived as a threat. Dr. Jordan paused for a brief moment, taken aback by the ferocity of her reaction. His mind raced with a dozen questions, but his professionalism kept him grounded. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "Your husband is in cardiac distress. He needs immediate medical intervention." But Lisa wasn't having it. "I said no," she snapped, her voice filled with anguish and defiance. "You're not touching him?" A ripple of tension passed through the room as the other diners exchanged uneasy glances. The once bustling atmosphere had now been replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. A waiter stood frozen, his hands clutching a phone, unsure whether to call for help or stay out of it altogether. Meanwhile, Lisa fumbled frantically with her own phone, her fingers trembling as she tried to dial the emergency number. "I'm calling the cops," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "This man is trying to hurt my husband." Dr. Jordan felt the familiar, sickening twist in his stomach, the kind that came from encountering racism in a place where lives were meant to be saved. He had seen it before, on hospital floors, in the streets, even in grocery stores. But never like this. Never when a man's life was on the line, and every second mattered. He wasn't going to let the color of his skin or Lisa's irrational fear stop him from doing what he knew had to be done. Just as Dr. Jordan prepared to explain, Mark's body spasmed violently, his back arching off the floor before crashing back down in a lifeless heap. Lisa's shrill scream echoed through the restaurant, piercing the already tense atmosphere. It was a gut-wrenching sound that only deepened Dr. Jordan's resolve. He couldn't wait any longer. In a swift motion, he pushed past Lisa, ignoring her desperate protests, and dropped to his knees beside Mark. "I'm not asking any more," he muttered under his breath, his voice low but resolute. Without another word, he placed his fingers on Mark's neck, feeling for a pulse. His heart skipped a beat as he found only the faintest trace of life, an almost imperceptible flutter that sent chills down his spine. The pulse was weak, barely there, and his mind raced with urgency. Lisa gasped, her eyes wide with horror as she looked on, unable to understand what was happening. You can't just—" she stammered, her voice faltering, but Dr. Jordan didn't give her a chance to finish. He interlocked his hands and began chest compressions, his movements steady and precise despite the chaos around him. 1, 2, 3, he counted aloud, his voice firm as his hands pressed down on Mark's chest. His arms burned with the effort, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Mark's body remained lifeless, unyielding, as Lisa continued to scream, her voice growing more frantic with each passing second. "Yes, send the police," she screamed into the phone. "There's a man here assaulting my husband." 4, 5, 6, Dr. Jordan continued, his voice unwavering as the sweat poured down his forehead. Outside, the unmistakable wail of sirens grew louder and louder, signaling the arrival of the authorities. The sound of rushing footsteps echoed through the restaurant just as the doors flew open and 2 uniformed officers burst inside, their hands poised above their weapons. "Step away from him!" one of them commanded, his voice stern and sharp. Lisa, seeing her chance, pointed desperately at Dr. Jordan. "Arrest him! He's trying to hurt my husband!" she cried out, her face contorted in a mix of fear and fury. But Dr. Jordan didn't even look up. His focus remained solely on Mark's lifeless body. 7, 8, 9, he counted, his voice steady, his hands pushing down on Mark's chest with unwavering force. The officers exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of how to proceed. Dr. Jordan's voice, calm yet unyielding, broke the silence. "Sir, we're telling you, he's dying," he said flatly. "If you stop me now, he's dead." The gravity of his words hung in the air, heavy and final. 10, 11, 12. Dr. Jordan's arms were on fire, his body trembling with exhaustion, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He was the only one who could save Mark now. Then, miraculously, something happened. Mark's chest rose just barely, so faint it was almost imperceptible. But it was enough. Another breath. A gasp. Mark's fingers twitched again, more deliberately this time, and his eyelids fluttered open. Slowly, his eyes blinked, and the room fell into stunned silence. The sound of his breath, shallow but steady, was the only thing that could be heard now. Lisa, unable to believe her eyes, collapsed beside her husband, tears streaming down her face as she whispered his name. The officers, their weapons now lowered, stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. One of the officers, his tone softer now, turned to Lisa. "Ma'am, is this the man you wanted us to arrest?" he asked, his voice gentle. Lisa's gaze flickered toward Dr. Jordan, who was now catching his breath, his face flushed with exhaustion. He had given everything, and it had worked. Mark was alive. But as Lisa opened her mouth to speak, she hesitated. Her mind was racing, the weight of the moment sinking in. She had called the cops on the man who had just saved her husband's life. Her lips parted, but the words didn't come. Instead, she said nothing. Just then, a paramedic arrived, clapping Dr. Jordan on the back. "You just saved his life, Doc," the paramedic said, his voice filled with awe and gratitude. Dr. Jordan let out a long, steady breath. His heart was still racing, his adrenaline still pumping, but he forced himself to calm down. He stood up, his legs trembling beneath him as he locked eyes with Lisa for one final moment. His expression was unreadable, his voice soft but clear. "I didn't do it for you," he said, his words carrying a weight that only Lisa seemed to understand. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Lisa standing in the middle of the restaurant, the full weight of the situation slowly crashing down on her. She had called the police on the very man who had saved her husband's life, and deep down she knew she would never forget this moment, the painful realization that fear and prejudice had clouded her judgment at a time when her husband's life had hung in the balance.